I started working on it. And on the one hand, there's this origin story, and some of you might have read Steve's memoir, Born Standing Up, just like a great, to me, one of the best books about comedy. But there's that story, which is a lot of what the DNA of this film is, um, which is this amazing, kind of young, solitary, cerebral journey of this guy trying to find his voice and it not working for almost 15 years. And then suddenly the culture and what he's doing just connects in a way that blows up. And then without telling anybody, he walks away and stops doing it. But at the same time, I was filming all this stuff with him that was like hanging with Steve, and just, and the energy of that was so different. And as we explore a lot in the second film, that Steve is really a different person now from who he was in this film. I mean, a number of people remarked on the fact that Steve has changed more than anybody else they've ever met.
Wow.
Like, Steve was really the lonely guy, for a long time. But the Steve I met, had a wife and a kid and a band and Marty and, an illustrator he was collaborating with, and there were people everywhere. And I was like, well, how did this guy become that guy?
Mm-hmm.
And that became kind of the driving question of the second film. But that I was fortunate enough to not just to be able to figure out what it wanted to be naturally without having to tell anybody. So for about 6 months, I was just gathering, and then I finally just felt like everything was going in these two different pots. There was like the archival origin story pot and this like verite hanging with Steve pot. And I said, well, rather than doing the traditional documentary thing where you kind of cut back and forth in your timelines and everything, and I've done that and that can work, but it's also often, to me, unsatisfying because you're either attached to one timeline more than the other, and you can't ever establish a real consistent tone and pace and everything. And I just thought, well, what if I just make two different films and they can be individual and they can have their own tone? And then I got really excited about it. And so I came up with this idea that I would have two different editors who weren't allowed to talk to each other. And then I had two different composers and two different graphics designers and everything. And so I was like, you guys are just going to be in your own cubbies and we're going to work on it. And so up until we got to Fine Cut, the editors weren't allowed to see the other film.
Wow.
And then at that point, we kind of dropped the veil and they saw it. And like, of course, I was looking across both, so I knew where it might rub or where they're maybe trying to use some of the same material, which I think was one line they both wanted to use.
What was the line?
It's a line, there's one line that's in both films, which the sister says, there weren't a lot of hugs. Yeah.
Wow. So was it always a part of the plan for this first, once you decided that there were two parts, was it always a part? What struck me was that we'd never see him in live time in this first part.
Yeah.
Was that always a part of kind of the rules of making the first
Kind
part?
of. I mean, I was, like I said, I was about 6 months in. And at that point, we'd done enough archival work that I felt like I had the goods to get away with telling this story with what we had. And so much of the footage in here has never been seen. So, I mean, obviously all that black and white stuff that Steve shot of himself and interviewing his, dad and all that stuff. But also a lot of the performance stuff. His manager had shot a couple of concerts of his in 1974 at the boarding house in San Francisco, and never did anything with it. So it was unseen. And he had all the camera angles, everything. It was like, those moments when you're making an archival film, those moments like make your week, make your month. So I felt like we had the goods to do that. But I didn't know that. In the beginning, some of the interviews in here that you hear, I shot.
Okay.
Yeah. But there was a point after about 6 months where I was like, nope, I'm not going to do it. So then I started doing audio interviews as I kept going. And part of my process also is start shooting, but start editing very quickly.
Mhm.
And then I just keep shooting and keep editing, and I try and get a feedback loop going between the edit and the shooting. So,
Mhm.
so then, the questions I have in the edit bay, I just start asking people when I'm talking to them, and it just becomes something that becomes like a big conversation.
Mm. I'm curious about kind of the animated visual pictures in this, and it had a very specific feel that kind of feels like him, or like it's kind of funny, the movement and
Yeah.
stuff. Can you just talk a little bit about that?
Well, there was all this amazing photography. So, and I've used animation in films before, but I wanted the animation to be rooted in photography, so more collage.
Mhm.
And then, looking, you can look at your Terry Gilliams and all these other people, but there was actually a Canadian artist I really liked named Winston Hacking that did some great stuff.
Mhm.
So that influenced me a lot. And so then we, just kind of played with it. And, I did, on this film, I worked with Scott Grossman, who I've worked with forever, doing a lot of my art stuff. But it was, again, that just trying to stay. I mean, what happens? This is the first time I've ever made a film just with archive and audio.
Yeah.
And I love those films, as they're great documentaries that do that. But the things I was learning about what happens when you do that, and it becomes much more of a time capsule because becomes more present tense and less retrospective when you're audio only, because you're not seeing people today looking back. You're kind of in the time period. You never mentally leave or visually leave the time period. And I really liked that part of it. It was a fun challenge.
Yeah, definitely. I got the sense that, I've just been living in that time, or kind of just hearing from him, like that version of him, because I never saw him as he is today.
Yeah.
So I thought that was really effective.
Till the next film, which is my editor, Jeff, said his favorite film in this project is the edit, or his favorite edit in this project is the edit from the first film to the second film. Because the second film, suddenly you're like, here's Hanging with Steve.
Yeah.
It's like, oh, that guy.
Yeah.
That was fun. And knowing I had that gave me the courage of my convictions to feel like I could live in the time.
Yeah.
In the archive.
Yeah. You've made such a robust list of wonderful documentaries, and I'd love to just hear a little more about what brings you, what draws you to make, why documentaries and not fiction, and what kind of draws you to.
Why fiction?
Yeah.
I know. I mean, I've been making documentaries for so long, 31 years. And so, for a long time, documentaries were the spinach of filmmaking, that it was like, oh, when are you going to make real movies? And all that kind of stuff that we all documentarians grit our teeth. That has changed significantly over the years, but it was that way for a long time. But I came out of journalism, and I was of the generation who, I was greatly influenced by new journalism, and my heroes were like the Joan Didions and Gay Talese, and these like writers who are applying fiction storytelling techniques to nonfiction writing, and that's all the stuff I was thinking about. And I feel like that's what I've been doing my whole career, is like exploring the kind of cinematic storytelling techniques to nonfiction stories. But I started 31 years ago. My first film was called Shotgun Freeway, Drives Through Lost LA, this Mondo LA history documentary that I did because I was a kid from LA who moved back east for school. And I'd talk about LA history and people would laugh at me. And I was like, well, I'm going to show you. I'm going to make a documentary about LA history. And that documentary ended up having I got John Didion to be in it, and James O'Rourke, Buck Henry, and a bunch of different people, and like talking about the idea of what history means in a city like LA. And I've actually done a trilogy of LA history films. Like I did one called The Cool School about the birth of the modern art scene in LA in the 50s and 60s around the Ferris Gallery and all of that. And my first job I got when I came to LA to make my first documentary, because I had no money, was producing Huell Hauser's show. Remember Huell Hauser?
Wow.
So you don't, because you're too young and not. But it was all that kind of California history stuff that I was really into. And then I was just making films about whatever I was into for a long time. And then after about 15 years, I was like, oh, I make films about culture. Like, it didn't occur to me until I looked back at what I've been doing. I was like, oh, I like, not just film, but music and art and culture more broadly, which is how do we define ourselves? How do we find other people? Language and food and everything. And that's always been the kind of thing I come back to, because it's the stuff that the stuff I do when I'm not working is the stuff I do when I'm working, which is, I'm lucky that way.
Yeah, that makes sense. We were talking out in the hall that everyone has their kind of different ways in, or the different reasons why they might know about Steve Martin. And I guess for you, what was kind of the nugget of why you were excited to tell this story?
I mean, I was of the age where every kid in school had memorized his albums. Not every kid, at least all my friends had, myself included. So he went on SNL October of '76. So I was 8. And my dad was a big SNL fan. So I remember watching that and then even it's hard to even remember that Steve, even though he's kind of an adult comedian, was on the Muppet Show and in the Muppet Movie and on the cover of Dynamite magazine. And like, he was somebody who had this, what I loved about it, which is what I loved about Monty Python, is like, it played for kids who didn't get most of it, and it played for adults. Like, it just, whatever you bring to it, you could take something out of it. And I was and then The Jerk came out when I was 11 or whatever, and I was such a fan that I got my dad to drive me to Las Vegas to see Steve do stand-up at the Riviera Hotel. They turned out to be some of the last shows he ever did. So I was 12 then when I saw him. So I feel like I've been preparing for this film for a long time. But then I've always, paid attention to his career. I had read several of his books. I'd read his memoir. I'd seen his play Picasso Le Panagile, and but it's funny because when I started making documentaries, I made business cards that said, with my company Tremolo, it said, where the high and the low meet, is what I put on my business cards. And I was like, that is Steve Martin. It's like exactly what I like. It's like incredibly smart and incredibly stupid, and I kind of love being able to work between those poles. I'm always interested in that, like high art, low art, the conversation between the two. And Steve, to me, was like the dream subject to get into a lot of that.
Yeah, totally. Is there, I guess, what was fascinating to me was just to hear how he studied, philosophy, and was using that in how he was kind of approaching his comedy. And that makes a lot of sense, but it's just, I don't know.
But you would never know it from seeing a guy with an arrow through his head. Right. That it was really based on, deep philosophical precepts of what he thought might work in the nature of comedy.
Totally. I guess as you've been kind of framing this story of trying to tell a story about him, what have you learned about him, or anything that has surprised you about, or understood more deeply about what he is?
I learned a lot about him.
Yeah.
And I will say that when I finally showed the film to him, because forever he said he didn't think he was going to watch the film. And then at a certain point I said, well, maybe there's a director. We know a couple of directors in common. I was like, well, maybe if somebody we both respect could watch it and like just, put your mind at ease or something. And he said, well, the problem with that is they'll have an opinion. The only opinion I care about is yours, which I thought was really great.
Yeah.
And so then I said, okay, well, I'm going to send you a link on Friday or Saturday. And he said, okay, but I'm probably not going to watch it. So I wake up Saturday morning. There's an email saying I didn't get the link. And I said, well, I said I was going to send it Friday or Saturday, but I'll send it today at noon, Saturday. And he said, okay, thanks, but I'm probably not going to watch it. You know? So at 3:30 Saturday, send the link. 3:30, I get an email from him saying, loved it. And then 10 minutes later, I got an email saying, can I show it to my shrink? I was like, for a documentary filmmaker, I think that's about the best we can do.
Yeah.
Because I think, yeah, I mean, he learned, but I always say that making a documentary with a living subject like this is very therapeutic. It's like an active therapy because I'm asking them to investigate the most important questions in their life and talk about them. But I said the thing you may not realize is it's also therapy for me, you know, and the issues that I resonate with are the ones, you know, from your life are the ones that speak to me. And I think there were a lot of things in Steve's life that spoke to me about, you know, the kind of the value of persistence, the kind of trying to balance workaholism with happiness and, you know, daddy issues, you know, like you name it, you know. So there was a lot of stuff that I was attracted to and that spoke to me. And I feel like that, because I've had people say this to me, having seen it now, like it's in a way, you know, this first film is a kind of a portrait of how to be an artist too, as like a young person trying to find your voice and having the courage of your convictions when the world doesn't give you a lot of evidence that you're right, you know. So, you know, those kinds of things were resonating with me in a way that was more important than kind of Steve's canon or his the kind of what I'd say like the Wikipedia version of his life. You know, it's much more of these kind of philosophical questions, but those were the questions he has always been asking of himself, which is great for a subject. And like I said, really, he was like the perfect subject for me to want to work on.
And he seemed to have kind of well documented himself too, right? Or were those real journal entries?
Those are all his journals. Yeah. I mean, he had this, his basement had tons of boxes of stuff. And Katie, right there, spent a couple of months in his basement scanning and going through things. And I remember there was a box in his basement labeled private, which was kind of off limits for a long time. And then at a certain point, it was this, do you think we could look in the private box? And he acquiesced, you know, and some of those journals and kind of private things were in there, which were a huge help. And the fact that, yeah, I mean, to be able to get into somebody's mind in real time and, you know, but like I love all that kind of, real time evidence of their life.
Yeah. And it's so he had such clarity too, and giving himself till age 30, right, to make it.
I mean, that connection that we ended up making in the film, that boarding house show, what he wrote in his diary was literally the week of his 30th birthday.
Yeah.
You know, it was crazy. He hadn't made that connection.
Oh, really?
No, you know. But when we looked at it, we're like, oh my God, that's kind of amazing.
What do you hope folks take from watching these films, or?
Well, in the same way, you know, that for me they resonated because they're, you know, I think there's a lot to be learned about the kind of artistic journey and all these things in the first film. The second film, you know, our kind of nickname for the second film is The Pursuit of Happiness. And I think there's a lot of interesting kind of wisdom that Steve turned his persistence in what you see in comedy and banjo and magic and everything to trying to figure out his happiness, you know, later in life. And that persistence is, to me, very, something to be emulated if you can. But, there are a lot of good lessons in that. So I do think there are a lot of more takeaways than you would think for something like I try to not think about, like if you can end up watching these films and stop thinking about, oh, he's a celebrity, that's great. It's like, no, he's just this guy who we're spending time with, who's trying to figure his shit out, and like in that way, that's why I try to kind of, there are major things in his career that I don't get into just because the only reason they're there is they happen, but they're not actually important to his life, so it's like trying to just say, I only really care about what affects his life, how he sees the world, how he's changed, and those kinds of questions.